Tilda, to what extent would you say COVID-19 impacted both uptake and cost of commercial real estate in the country in 2020?
I think because of the impact of COVID-19 on the economy and the fact that COVID-19 was quite unprecedented, so most of the occupiers or tenants in buildings had to go back into the drawing board, especially for those who were supposed to uptake new space. And so that did lead to low uptake levels in terms of commercial space. In terms of cost, we have seen, because of the things that we've had to deal with in terms of remote working, the growth in terms of well-being trends. So we have seen a flight to quality towards grade A buildings, and so the cost of that has actually increased. But for grade B and the other lower quality spaces, that has definitely impacted on their costs because those have declined.
Looking at Nairobi as the hub for commercial real estate in the country and even in the region, what are some of the areas in Nairobi that were adversely affected?
In terms of Nairobi, of course, the CBD has continued to be impacted as people move on to other hubs in the city towards Westlands and also Kilimani. But we have also seen these new hubs, upcoming hubs, also being impacted because of the oversupply in this. And so, as I mentioned, the market was subdued. So these are also areas that are being impacted by the pandemic.
You've mentioned twice that the market was subdued even before COVID. Briefly, what had caused this shift?
I think we were coming off from a season of what we would call as oversupply. It was a period where we saw quite a lot of space coming up, whether it's grade A offices, whether it's grade B offices. We were coming off where we had a lot of stock and high vacancy rates in buildings. And so we had not gone through a market correction to have that stabilized. So because of the impact of the pandemic, then that led to higher vacancy rates being reported.
Now, speaking of availability of space in the market, grade A and grade B saw space decrease by 50%, but absorption dropped by 47%. What would we attribute these numbers to?
These numbers were recorded in the first half of the year 2020, and this can directly be attributed to the policies and the sort of government responses that were adopted. So when lockdowns came into place, and for example, the norm towards remote working, then that meant that people do not have to occupy space. And so as a result, for people who had not already occupied space, then that led to some of them cancelling their new uptakes or deferring their decisions to take up space. For people who had already occupied space, we did see that most of them wanted to close shop because of how the pandemic had impacted their businesses. And so that also contributed in the high vacancy levels and the low levels in terms of absorption of space.
However, in the second half of the year, we see an increase in absorption by 13%.
Yeah. So in the second half of the year, what happened is that there was an increase in occupier activity. I think after people had gone back to the drawing board and people had revisited their options, then there were occupiers seeking to leverage on the available quality space that was in the market and also shifting their businesses. Also, we did see that most of the business re-strategized where people occupied large spaces. They did want to occupy some smaller spaces, and so that led to some increased occupier activity in the market in the second half of the year.
Now, there was a general cash crunch in the market in 2020. I mean, the economy contracted from about 5% to negative 1.5% according to the World Bank. How did this affect rent payment, acquisition of new houses or properties, and even leasing?
Initially, from the very start of the pandemic, we did see that landlords had to react quite fast in order to retain tenants and also attract new ones. So for most of the tenants, we did see that rent deferrals were given or rent discounts. But you have to understand, especially for commercial spaces, these are payments that are made earlier on in advance. So some of the effects of the pandemic, we are only seeing them now when, for example, people have to renew their leases. So this is when we are seeing some lease concessions being adopted. Of course, in terms of things like lease renewals and lease deferrals, those were also activities that we did see where, as I mentioned, where companies had in the strategy to take up new space, they had to defer that decision and also just have to deal with the uncertainty in the market. So it's been quite a period of uncertainty, but of course, most people have had to innovate and deal with the situation. Yeah.
And speaking of the innovation, I mean, bad as it may sound, 72% of commercial spaces were occupied. How did landlords find a way around the pandemic to just ensure that they work with their tenants to keep everybody going?
Yeah, so there were different ways really. So first, in terms of retaining your tenants, you have to meet them at their point of needs. And so for most tenants who were really hard pressed for currency and for cash, then they had to give rent discounts and rent deferral solutions.
Let's change gears a little bit and talk about the retail space, because it's also very key, and it was adversely affected because businesses were shutting down and people were being told to stay at home. How far did the impact of COVID-19 on the retail space go continental-wise?
I think the retail space has been an interesting one to watch because what happened is that if you divide it into the different sectors that it covers, you can see that there's the essential services where your normal grocery and supermarkets, those did continue to operate as business as usual, where for non-essential services where you find these are restaurants, branded fashion, in most of the countries, these were adversely impacted because they had to stop operations altogether to deal with the lockdown period. However, an interesting fact you will see is that branded fashion, for example, in cities such as Kampala and Nairobi, continued to record high sales even during the pandemic period. So this can be attributed to the fact that there was no international travel, and so people had to shop locally, and they also had to shop for the different brands locally. So that was an interesting trend that came out of the pandemic.
And speaking of interesting trends, Cairo, Casablanca, Kinshasa, Kampala, they recorded growth. What was this growth spurred by amid a pandemic?
I think the interesting thing that you will notice is that the real estate sector quite closely tracks what's happening at the macroeconomic level. And so for cities such as Cairo, Kampala and Casablanca, these are cities that have actually been recording quite positive growth, especially for Cairo and Kampala. And so you realize that despite the pandemic, this continued to record stellar growth. When you look at Kinshasa, it's a city that has been dealing with undersupply for quite some time, and so it's a market that was quite stable even during the pandemic because it's really not oversupplied per se, and there's still demand for space. So that's why the cities recorded quite positive growth.
On the flip side, you look at Harare, you look at Johannesburg, you look at Addis Ababa, they didn't record good scores when it comes to ratings in terms of how they performed, both in the second quarter of 2020, the third quarter of 2020, and the change in the 6 months and demand for space. Were there underlying issues pre-pandemic, or it's just the pandemic?
So the interesting thing about all the cities is that there were different reasons really. So for example, when you look at a market such as Harare, the economy was quite subdued even pre-pandemic, and COVID-19 of course posed the twin shock in terms of economic and health care aspects. We've seen inflation remain quite high, and there's also a challenge in terms of their currency. And so all this went in terms of informing the level of decline in the market. For Johannesburg, South Africa was already in recession phase pre-pandemic, and we also did see quite a big currency depreciation during that period. And so when you look at dollar-based trends, this of course declined based on due to currency depreciation, and also because of the economic downturn. For example, when you look at retail, when people do not have money to spend, then the sector cannot prosper. For Addis Ababa, which is an interesting city that was already recording quite some good progress, but because of the political situation in the country and also because of the COVID-19 pandemic, then this also served to impact the level of market activity in the country and also to lead to a decline. However, for Addis Ababa, I would anticipate that that is quite short term and that it will recover quite soon.
Give me a number. The market contracted by 6%. That's commercial real estate in 2020. 2021. What number are you putting it at? Positive or still negative?
Still negative.
What number would you give it?
I'd put it at 4%.
4%.
Yeah.
Tilda Moy, that's where we leave it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.